It started with the sound of tires where no tires should have ever been, deep in the woods, far beyond the county line, crunching over pine needles and snapping branches on the narrow dirt path that only my family used for hunting season. And only after the frost had hardened the ground. That sound alone was enough to make Grandpa set his coffee mug down with a quiet, measured thud on the porch rail. The old man's ears caught what most folks wouldn't, a rumble that didn't belong here, an engine too polished, too heavy, too full of arrogance to be one of ours. He didn't say a word at first, just reached behind the wooden chair, pulled out his binoculars, and stared through the trees toward the bend that led to the trailhead. I stood beside him, still half asleep, my breath fogging the early morning air, watching as a dark green Jeep with a cheap plastic light bar and fake police decals slowly rolled into view. The words HOA Enforcement were stenciled across the doors, but anyone who lived out here knew there wasn't a homeowners association for 10 miles in any direction. Grandpa's jaw tightened. "They're back," he muttered, more to himself than to me, and that sentence alone sent a chill through my spine. Because they meant trouble, the kind of trouble that didn't care about fences, property lines, or laws. These were the same people who'd been harassing our neighbors for weeks, driving up and down private gravel roads pretending to be officers, issuing fake citations, threatening folks with imaginary fines. They'd even broken a gate at Miller's ranch, claiming it was blocking HOA access, though Miller's land had never been under any HOA authority. Now they'd come here, to our trail. Grandpa stood up, stretched his back with that slow stiffness of a man who'd seen too many winters, and said, "Go tell your father. Tell him it's time to bring out the spikes." That was when I realized he wasn't playing around. We'd built that hunting trail ourselves back in the 90s, carved it out of the hillside with pickaxes and an old borrowed tractor, and Grandpa always said it was sacred ground, our escape, our legacy. Nobody, not even the county, had the right to trespass on it. I sprinted to the barn, heart pounding, yelling for Dad, who was cleaning his rifle and listening to an old country station. The moment I told him, he didn't even blink. He grabbed the steel strip we kept hanging by the back door, a spiked chain from an old threshing machine, sharpened and bent into an evil grin, and nodded toward the truck. "Let's go teach some manners," he said. Meanwhile, Grandpa had already disappeared into the woods, moving faster than a man his age should have been able to. When we reached the trailhead, the fake HOA Jeep was parked just past the no trespassing sign. 2 men stood outside it, dressed in tactical gear that looked store-bought, not issued, too clean, too new. One wore sunglasses despite the forest shade. The other had a radio on his shoulder and was pretending to talk into it, giving off the air of authority that only works on those too timid to question it. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Grandpa's voice boomed from the tree line before we even stepped out. The men turned, startled. "Sir, this is private HOA property," the one with sunglasses said, his tone arrogant. "We've had reports of illegal structures and we're authorized to inspect." Grandpa laughed, a dry, brittle sound that cut the air. "HOA property? You city boys must have taken a wrong turn somewhere between your fantasy and my land." I could see the tension rise. Dad standing next to me with his arms crossed, every inch of his posture saying this is not going to end well for you. The man with the radio puffed up his chest. "If you don't comply, we can issue citations and—" Grandpa cut him off. "You can issue yourself a map before I turn that Jeep into a chicken coop." That should have been the end of it. But arrogance doesn't die easy, and these fake cops had egos bigger than their lies. Instead of leaving, they decided to drive deeper, right down the hunting trail, the one lined with pine and birch, the one that barely fit a four-wheeler. The Jeep's tires spat mud and tore bark from tree roots as it lurched forward, bumping over the uneven path like a drunk bull in a china shop. Grandpa didn't chase them. He just turned to us with a slow smile that I hadn't seen since the blizzard of '89, when he'd rigged the generator with car batteries after the town's power went out. "Bring the road chain," he said softly, and that's when I understood. The spikes weren't for defense. They were for lesson teaching. We followed him to the exit road, a narrow dirt loop that connected the far end of the trail to the highway. It was the only way out unless someone wanted to reverse a mile through trees. Grandpa knelt down, his hands trembling only slightly as he spread the spiked chain across the dirt, half buried beneath fallen leaves. "These boys think they can play police," he muttered, tightening each end to steel rods hammered into the soil. "Let's see how good their tires hold up under country law." The sound of the Jeep's engine echoed faintly through the trees, closer, angrier. They were coming back, probably realizing there was nothing to inspect but old deer blinds and campfire ashes. Grandpa stood, brushing his hands together. Now we wait. Minutes later, the forest erupted with the crunch of gravel and the roar of a frustrated engine. The Jeep burst out of the trees, its headlights cutting through the dim light like a beast clawing for escape. Both men were inside, shouting something, probably arguing about how to spin this disaster in their little HOA fantasy world. Then came the sound. Pop, hiss, grind, a metallic symphony that made Grandpa's grin widen. The Jeep jerked, listed to one side, and skidded to a stop as both front tires shredded under the spikes. Steam hissed from the hood and the engine coughed. "Welcome to the countryside," Grandpa murmured. The men jumped out, cursing, one of them kicking the dirt like it was to blame. "What the hell happened?" the radio man yelled. Grandpa and Dad stepped out of the trees, calm as ghosts. "You drove where you weren't invited," Grandpa said. "And my road don't forgive strangers." The men froze. One of them reached for something under his vest, but Dad lifted his phone, its screen already recording. "Go ahead," he said. "Add assault to your list of fake charges." They hesitated, the bravado draining from their faces. "You'll pay for this," the sunglass guy said, trying to sound tough. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Grandpa's laugh rolled out again, deep and dangerous. "Son, I've been dealing with snakes longer than you've been shaving." That was when the sheriff's truck appeared, rolling slow down the gravel from the north side. Sheriff Boone had known Grandpa for 40 years. They'd hunted elk together, built fence lines together. He stepped out, hat low, eyes scanning the scene. "Morning, Bill," he said to Grandpa. "Morning, Sheriff," Grandpa replied. Boone turned his gaze to the Jeep. "Guessing these are your visitors?" "They claim to be HOA cops," Grandpa said dryly. Boone raised an eyebrow. "HOA cops?" He walked up to the Jeep, examining the fake decals and plastic badges. Then he looked at the men who were sweating under his stare. "You boys got any real ID?" They hesitated. That was enough. Boone sighed, resting a hand on his belt. "Let me guess. Trespassing, impersonating an officer, vandalism?" He didn't need their answer. He knew. Within minutes, the situation flipped. The fake HOA men were cuffed and sitting on the ground, their faces red with embarrassment as Boone read them their rights. Grandpa stood silent, arms folded, watching like a man watching weeds get pulled from his garden. But the story didn't end there. While the sheriff was running their plates, another Jeep appeared at the top of the trail. Same green paint, same fake decals. 3 more men inside, radios blaring. "We got company," Dad whispered. Grandpa didn't move. Boone stepped into the road, his badge catching the light. The new arrivals froze as soon as they saw him. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Boone said. "Care to explain why you're impersonating law enforcement on private land?" One of them tried to speak, but his voice cracked. We were told this property was under HOA authority. We're with the inspection team." Boone chuckled. "Inspection team, huh? Funny. The county clerk says this land's been in the McAllister family since 1952. Ain't no HOA within 10 miles. The men exchanged panicked glances. The sheriff motioned to his deputy, who'd arrived moments earlier. "Round 'em up," he said. By evening, 5 men sat handcuffed on the back of 2 cruisers, their Jeep tires flat, their fake badges confiscated. The sheriff told us later they were part of a scam, city grifters pretending to represent homeowners' associations, extorting money and property access from rural folks who didn't know better. But they'd picked the wrong mountain, the wrong family, and the wrong old man to mess with. Grandpa said nothing while they were taken away. He just picked up the spiked chain, coiled it over his shoulder, and muttered, "Ain't nothing fake about country justice." That night, we sat by the fire behind the house, the stars spilling over us like cold silver dust. Dad poured Grandpa a glass of whiskey. And for the first time all day, the old man smiled. Not the sharp grin of vengeance, but a soft, tired one. "You did good, boy," he told me. "Remember this. When men come waving power they don't have, it's not the badge that matters. It's the backbone." I'll never forget that line. It stuck with me even weeks later, when the sheriff called to say the men had confessed to a dozen fake operations across 3 counties. Grandpa didn't gloat. He just said, maybe they'll learn something behind bars that they couldn't learn on my land. But the thing is, something strange happened after that. The fake HOA men might have been gone, but one morning Dad found tire tracks again. Not Jeep tracks this time. Heavier, wider, deeper. Someone had been back on the trail in the middle of the night. No footprints, no broken chains, no sounds. Just tracks leading to the same clearing where the Jeep had been spiked. Grandpa said nothing when he saw them. He just stood there, hands in his coat pockets, eyes narrowed toward the woods. "Guess the lesson didn't stick," he murmured. Then, after a pause, he added quietly, "Or maybe someone else is coming." The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of morning that made the air feel thick and the woods seem watchful. Every branch dripping with dew like the trees themselves were sweating. Grandpa was already outside before sunrise, standing at the end of the drive with his old Winchester leaning against his shoulder, staring down the hill at the tire tracks that cut across the mud. They weren't fresh enough to still glisten, but fresh enough to smell like rubber and oil when you walked near them. Dad joined him, mug of coffee in one hand, the other scratching at his chin. "You think it's the same crew?" he asked quietly. Grandpa didn't answer right away. He crouched down, ran a hand along one of the grooves, and frowned. "Different tread. Too wide for a Jeep. Looks like a truck this time. Maybe more than one." That made my stomach tighten. After what happened yesterday, you'd think word would have spread fast enough to scare off any imitators. But out here, word travels slow and pride travels faster. Some men don't take kindly to being humiliated, especially by an old-timer and his family with a spike chain and a camera. By mid-morning, the sheriff called to confirm what we'd already guessed. The arrested HOA impersonators had posted bail overnight. Someone from out of state had wired the money. Boone said they were being uncooperative, which in his voice meant dangerous. "Keep your eyes open, Bill," he told Grandpa over the line. "I've got deputies watching the back roads, but you know how deep those trails run." Grandpa's response was calm. "I'll keep my land quiet," he said, and hung up. That was his way. Never a wasted word, never a hint of fear. But after he hung up, he went to the shed and pulled out an old metal case I hadn't seen in years. Inside was his collection of trail cameras, motion sensors, and tripwire alarms, leftovers from his logging days when he'd had to protect equipment from poachers and copper thieves. "If they want to play games," he said, "we'll play chess." We spent the rest of the day wiring the forest. Every few hundred feet along the hunting trail, we strapped a camera to a tree, each one camouflaged under bark-colored tape and moss. The air smelled like pine sap and damp earth as we worked, and for the first time in years, the woods felt foreign to me, like something was watching back. Around noon, Dad pointed to the ridge above the clearing. "You see that?" I followed his gaze and froze. There was a glint of light, just for a second, like sunlight bouncing off glass. Then it was gone. "Scope," Grandpa muttered. "Somebody's watching." We dropped low, moving back toward the truck. No movement followed us, but the silence afterward was louder than any sound. Even the birds seemed to have stopped. When we got home, Grandpa loaded the footage from the first 2 cameras we'd already installed earlier that morning. At first, everything looked normal. Trees swaying, deer wandering, a raccoon sniffing the ground. Then, around 2 a.m., one camera caught headlights in the distance. 2 vehicles. Both stopped near the clearing where we'd spiked the Jeep. 5 figures got out, silhouetted, faces hidden under caps. They moved like they knew what they were doing. One of them kicked at the dirt where the spikes had been, another pointed a flashlight toward the trees. Then one of them raised what looked like a small canister, spraying something over the ground. "What's that?" I asked. Grandpa zoomed in, the old screen flickering. "Acid," he said. "They're trying to eat away tire evidence." That chilled me worse than the wind. They weren't just random vandals. They were covering their tracks like professionals. The footage ended with one of the men turning toward the camera, his face catching just enough light to show a scar running across his cheek. Grandpa froze the frame. "That ain't one of the 5 from yesterday," he muttered. "That's someone new." We sent the photo to Sheriff Boone, who promised to check it against records. But that night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the tree line, listening for engines, for footsteps, for anything. And that's when I saw it. Faint red dots moving in the dark like the blinking lights of walkie-talkies or laser sights. 1, 2, 3, then gone. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I'd imagined it. But the hairs on my arm stood straight up. I woke Dad, who came running with his flashlight, but by the time he looked, the woods were still again. The next morning, Boone came by in person. He looked tired, his uniform dusty from the back roads. "Got an ID," he said, handing Grandpa a printout. The scarred man's name was Landon Frey, an ex-security contractor who'd been kicked out of a Texas firm for falsifying credentials and extortion. "He's been running a group that sells neighborhood security packages to fake HOAs, Boone explained. "Guess they didn't like getting embarrassed yesterday." Grandpa's face didn't move, but I could tell something hard set behind his eyes. "So what's their play?" Dad asked. "You think they'll come back?" Boone sighed. "If they're half as proud as I think they are, yeah. But don't do anything reckless, Bill. Let us handle it." Grandpa nodded, but we all knew he wouldn't sit idle. Sure enough, that night the dog started barking around 11 p.m. We rushed outside with flashlights, the beam cutting across the pasture, and there it was. A drone, buzzing just above the treetops, its red light blinking like a heartbeat. Grandpa didn't hesitate. He raised his shotgun and fired once. The drone sparked, spun out, and crashed somewhere near the creek. We found it minutes later, still smoking, its camera lens cracked, but its memory card intact. "You boys are getting bold," Grandpa muttered, pocketing it. The footage on it later showed us everything. Our yard, our barn, our vehicles, every inch of our land mapped and scanned. The drone had been circling for hours, recording angles like someone planning an attack or a raid. The next day, Boone returned again, bringing 2 deputies. They patrolled the perimeter and promised to keep watch, but Grandpa seemed unconvinced. "Sheriff," he said, "these fellas don't scare easy. You might catch 1 or 2, but the rest will wait. And when they come, it won't be with cameras." Boone nodded grimly. "Then we make sure they regret it." He handed Grandpa a box of motion-triggered flares from the evidence locker. "If they move in, light 'em up and call me." 2 nights later, the storm rolled in, rain thick as nails, wind howling through the trees like wolves. The whole sky flashed white every few seconds, and the thunder shook the windows. It was the perfect night for anyone to move unseen. Around midnight, I heard the alarm trip, the one wired to the South Trail. Dad was up instantly, grabbing the radio. "Zone 3, he said. "Someone's in." Grandpa was already pulling on his boots. We moved fast but quiet, flashlights off, rifles slung. The rain soaked us to the bone by the time we reached the tree line, but through the downpour we saw them. 3 men, headlights off, pushing an ATV through the mud. They were wearing ponchos, moving toward the clearing. "What do we do?" I whispered. Grandpa's reply was calm, steady. "We teach 'em again." He motioned to Dad, who circled behind the clearing with one of the flares. The men didn't know we were there until the night exploded in red light. The flare roared up, bathing the forest in a crimson glow that made the rain look like falling blood. The intruders froze, caught like deer. "You boys lost again?" Grandpa's voice thundered through the storm. One of them bolted, slipping in the mud. The other 2 raised their hands instinctively. "Don't shoot! We just came for our drone," one yelled. Grandpa stepped forward, shotgun still low but ready. "Your drone's at the sheriff's office, and you'll be there too if you don't move slow." They didn't. Instead, the 3rd man, the one who'd fallen, pulled something shiny from under his coat. Grandpa didn't hesitate. He fired once into the dirt beside the man's hand, the blast echoing through the trees. The message was clear. Within minutes, Boone's deputies arrived, sirens wailing faintly through the rain. The men were arrested again, though the scarred one, Frey, was nowhere to be seen. After that, the sheriff stationed a patrol car at the end of the gravel road for a week, Things quieted down, but Grandpa didn't relax. "They ain't done," he kept saying. "That Frey fella's too proud to walk away." He was right. A week later, Boone called to say Frey had been spotted in town buying supplies, chains, fuel cans, and night vision gear. "He's planning something big," Boone warned. "Stay ready!" Grandpa's answer was short. "Always am." That evening, we reinforced the cabin. Dad nailed boards across the windows. I double-checked the generators, and Grandpa walked the perimeter with his old lantern, muttering under his breath like he was talking to the land itself. "They don't belong here," he said softly. "This place remembers. The woods remember." It was half prayer, half promise. Around 3 a.m., the dogs went berserk again. This time it wasn't just one bark, it was chaos, the kind that means they're here. Lights flickered inside the house as Dad grabbed his rifle. I peeked out the window and saw headlights, 2 trucks, engines revving low, creeping up the dirt road. "They're back," I said, heart hammering. Grandpa's eyes were calm but cold. "Then let's make sure they never come again." He turned off the lights, opened the back door, and stepped into the dark. The rain had stopped, but the air still hummed with leftover thunder. We followed, crouched low behind the old stone fence. The truck stopped about 50 feet away, and 5 figures stepped out, one unmistakably Frey, Scar catching the light of a cigarette. He tossed it to the ground, crushed it under his boot, and said, "You think you can embarrass me on camera, old man? I'm taking what's mine." Grandpa's reply was barely above a whisper, but I swear the woods carried it like wind. "This land don't belong to thieves." Then he reached into his coat and pressed a button on a small black remote. From the trees behind them came a crackle and a hiss, then a blinding flash. The motion sensors had triggered the flares and alarms simultaneously, lighting up the entire trail in red and white. Frey and his men stumbled, covering their eyes, yelling. Grandpa didn't move. "You should have stayed in the city," he said. The ground beneath the trucks was already turning soft from the previous rain, and as they tried to back out, the tires spun helplessly in the mud. Then came the metallic crunch, a sound I recognized instantly. Grandpa had reset the spiked chain across the exit road earlier that evening. Both trucks lurched, their tires deflating in unison. Frey screamed in rage, slamming his fist on the hood. "You're dead, old man!" he roared, drawing his weapon. But before he could aim, red and blue lights flared behind him. Sheriff Boone's convoy had been waiting just down the hill, watching through binoculars the whole time. "Drop it!" Boone shouted through his megaphone. "Hands up!" The next few minutes were chaos. Shouts, flashlights, men running, mud flying. But by the time it was done, Frey and his crew were face down in the dirt, handcuffed again, this time for good. Boone approached Grandpa afterward, shaking his head in disbelief. "You really had to spike the road again, huh?" Grandpa grinned. "Worked last time." Boone laughed despite himself. "You're lucky I like you, Bill." The sheriff's report later confirmed everything. Frey's crew had planned to torch our cabin as revenge and frame us for insurance fraud. They'd brought accelerants, fake paperwork, even uniforms. If we hadn't caught them, it could have ended in flames. As the deputies hauled them away, Grandpa finally sat down on the porch, breathing slow and steady. "You did good," Dad told him. "You saved us." But Grandpa just stared out at the woods, eyes distant. "No," he said softly. "The land saved itself. I just helped it remember how." That night, as the patrol lights faded down the road, I looked out at the broken trucks, the churned mud, the faint glimmer of the spike chain half buried under the leaves, and realized something that still echoes in my mind. Some places protect themselves not through fences or laws, but through the people stubborn enough to stand their ground, no matter who pretends to be in charge. And Grandpa McAllister was that kind of man, unbreakable, unyielding, and dangerous to those who mistook his silence for weakness. The morning after the ambush, the world felt different, quieter, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Smoke still lingered in the damp air where Boone's deputies had burned the confiscated accelerants, and the faint stink of gasoline clung to the dirt near the road, a reminder of how close the night had come to ending in fire. Grandpa sat on the porch swing with his hat low, staring out toward the tree line where the last of the tire ruts disappeared into the mud. He hadn't said much since the arrests, and even though the sheriff assured us Frey and his men would be locked up for a long time, Grandpa's silence made me uneasy. He'd always been a man of words that mattered, but when those words stopped coming, you knew he was thinking, hard, deep, and dark. "It's not over," he muttered finally, the creak of the swing punctuating his words. "Men like Frey don't forgive. They wait, they rot. Then they send others." Dad tried to brush it off, telling him the sheriff would handle it, but Grandpa's eyes stayed fixed on the woods, and his voice grew low and sharp. "Son, I've seen this before. Evil don't die just because you arrest it. It changes faces." That night, while the rain eased and the fog crept back into the holler, Grandpa took a lantern, his toolbox, and that same spiked chain and vanished into the trees. When I found him hours later, the air was cold enough to bite. He was kneeling near the old hunting blind, hammering metal rods into the ground like he was staking the earth itself. "Grandpa," I whispered, "what are you doing?" He looked up, his face lit by the lantern's amber glow, eyes gleaming with that fierce glint that only came out when trouble was near. "They used the roads against us twice, so I'm making sure there's no third." He pointed deeper into the woods. "Every path in and out, every shortcut they could use, I'm sealing them." It wasn't just paranoia. It was strategy. By morning, he'd built what looked like an invisible web of deterrents, chains, traps, and alarms, all hidden beneath the forest floor. "This ain't about fear," he said when he caught me watching. "It's about memory. If they come again, I want this place to remember how to fight back." A week passed without incident. The sheriff's report said Frey's organization had fallen apart after his arrest. Several of his associates turned on each other, and the local news even ran a story calling Grandpa a folk hero for defending his land. People in town started stopping us at the feed store, shaking Grandpa's hand, offering him free coffee, thanking him for standing up to the city fakes. He hated it. Fame didn't suit him. "They'll move on to the next story soon," he said, dismissing the praise. "Folks love heroes till they find a new one." But even as life started returning to normal, small things began to feel off. At night, we'd hear distant sounds, low engines on the far ridge maybe, or a single gunshot echoing from nowhere. One morning, the barn door was open, though we'd locked it tight, and Grandpa's trail cameras were turned off, batteries ripped out clean. Boone came to check, but all he found were faint boot prints that led nowhere. Then came the letter. No envelope, no stamp, just a folded piece of paper left on the porch rail. The handwriting was jagged, like it had been written with a shaking hand. "You didn't win, old man. You just delayed it." The signature was a single initial, F. Grandpa didn't show it to Boone. He just crumpled it, tossed it into the fire, and said, "Guess Frey found himself a friend on the outside." That night, he didn't sleep. None of us did. The dogs wouldn't stop barking, pacing the yard as if they could smell something wrong in the air. The next day, Boone returned with bad news. Frey had escaped custody during transport. The van was found abandoned 50 miles south, its driver unconscious, its passenger door open. "We're putting out a state alert," Boone said. "But if he's coming for you, Bill, he's coming quiet." Grandpa didn't flinch. "Then I'll be waiting loud." From that moment, the farm became a fortress. Dad reinforced the doors with steel plates. I rewired the floodlights to motion sensors, and Grandpa, he started carrying his Winchester everywhere, even inside. He'd sit at the kitchen table with it resting across his lap, like an old soldier guarding his post. "He's gonna make his move when we least expect it," he said one night. "But he'll forget one thing. I don't sleep much anymore." Days turned into nights, and nights into tension. Every sound became suspect. Every flicker of light beyond the window made us flinch. The woods that once sang with crickets and owls now held its breath. Then, 3 nights after the escape, the power went out. Total darkness. No wind, no storm, just black. I grabbed my flashlight, but before I could switch it on, Grandpa whispered, "Don't, he cut it. He's out there." His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp as glass. We sat in silence, the faint smell of damp earth creeping through the cracks in the walls. Then we heard it, a faint crunch of boots on gravel, slow and deliberate, circling the porch. Grandpa motioned for Dad to stay low and slipped out the back door, silent as a ghost. Minutes felt like hours. Then came the sound of breaking glass. Someone was inside. The beam of my flashlight finally pierced the dark, revealing a figure in the hallway. Tall, muddy, face hidden behind a hood. "Don't move!" I yelled, my voice cracking. The figure turned slowly, and in that instant, lightning flashed outside, illuminating the scar on his cheek. Frey. He grinned, teeth glinting. "Miss me?" he whispered. Before I could answer, Grandpa's shotgun roared from behind him. The blast hit the wall inches from Frey's head, forcing him to dive sideways. "I warned you," Grandpa growled, stepping into the light. Frey lunged, knocking the gun aside. The two men crashed into the kitchen table, shattering it. For a second, all I could see was chaos, fists, blood, glass. Dad jumped in, swinging the butt of his rifle, catching Frey across the shoulder. He stumbled, but not enough. "You should have stayed out of it, old man," Frey shouted, pulling a knife. Grandpa didn't retreat. He grabbed the nearest thing he could reach, a heavy iron skillet, and swung with all the strength that 75 years of stubbornness could muster. The sound rang through the cabin like thunder. Frey dropped, stunned, blood pooling from his temple. But instead of collapsing, he smiled through his teeth. "You think this ends with me?" he hissed. "We're already here." Before any of us could process that, headlights flared outside. 3 vehicles this time, engines roaring. The front door burst open as 2 more men stormed in, both armed. Dad fired first, a warning shot that shattered the window, but they didn't stop. One lunged for me, grabbing my arm, and I swung the flashlight into his face. He howled, stumbling back. The second man charged at Grandpa, but before he could reach him, the old man kicked the lantern across the floor. It shattered, flames licking up the spilled kerosene. "You boys want to take the house?" Grandpa shouted over the roar. "Then burn with it!" The men panicked, stumbling back toward the doorway as the fire grew. Boone's sirens echoed in the distance, faint but closing. Frey, half-conscious, tried to crawl toward the back exit, but Grandpa grabbed him by the collar. "You made a mistake," he said. "You thought this was about pride? It's about home." Then he dragged him outside, where the rain had just begun to fall again. The sheriff's convoy tore up the driveway moments later, red and blue lights flashing like salvation through the smoke. The other intruders fled into the woods, but Boone's deputies gave chase. Frey lay in the mud, coughing, his knife somewhere lost in the chaos. Boone stepped out of his truck, his expression caught between fury and disbelief. "You again?" he said, looking down at Frey. "I told you not to come back here." Frey laughed weakly. "You can't stop what's coming," he said, his voice rasping. Boone just shook his head. "Yeah, I can," he muttered, hauling him up and cuffing him. By dawn, the fire was out, the intruders captured or scattered, and the cabin stood half-burned but unbroken. Grandpa refused to leave, even as the deputies suggested taking him into town for questioning. "This is my land," he said. "If they want me, they'll find me right here." He spent the morning sitting on the same porch swing, shotgun resting beside him, smoke rising from the blackened remains of the kitchen behind him. Boone approached slowly, hat in hand. "Bill, you're one stubborn old bastard," he said softly. Grandpa smirked. "Takes one to know one," Boone sighed. "We'll keep patrols around for a few weeks, make sure no one else gets stupid." Grandpa nodded but said nothing more. When Boone left, the woods seemed to exhale again as if finally relieved. But the strangest part came later when we went to check the trail cameras. Half of them had been destroyed, but one, hidden deep near the ridge, still worked. When we played the footage, we saw something that froze all of us. The night Frey attacked, there had been someone else watching, from farther back in the woods. A tall figure, unmoving, wearing a hooded coat, standing perfectly still as the chaos unfolded. He never approached, never intervened, just watched. And when the fire began to glow, he turned and disappeared into the dark. Grandpa replayed that clip over and over, his brow furrowed. "Not one of Frey's," he murmured. "Too tall, too calm?" Dad frowned. "Then who?" Grandpa didn't answer. He just stared at the screen and said quietly, "Maybe this place really does remember. Maybe it's protecting itself." Over the next few days, workers from town came to help rebuild the kitchen, and word spread fast about what had happened. Some called Grandpa a hero again. Others called him crazy for nearly burning down his own house to stop a gang. He didn't care. He just sat by the edge of the woods every evening, watching the trail, as if waiting for the trees to whisper something back. One night I joined him. The sky was full of stars, the kind you only see in the country when the air's clean and the noise of the world dies out. "You ever think about leaving?" I asked. He chuckled softly. "Leave what? My bones are part of this dirt. My blood's in the roots. You can't leave what owns you." I didn't understand then, but I do now. A month later, the sheriff confirmed Frey's gang was dismantled for good. The survivors confessed to dozens of scams across the state, and Frey himself faced federal charges. Boone personally came to deliver the news. "You're clear, Bill," he said. "No one's coming back." Grandpa nodded slowly, eyes distant. "Good," he said. "But I'll keep the chain ready anyway." Boone laughed. "I figured you would." The seasons changed after that. Spring crept in soft and green, wildflowers blooming where tire ruts once scarred the ground. Life moved on, but the memory of that night never left me. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the pines, you can still hear the faint jingle of metal under the soil, the sound of Grandpa's spike chain shifting, reminding anyone who listens that some lands aren't meant to be conquered. They're meant to be respected. Grandpa passed a few years later, sitting right there on the porch, watching the trail as the sun went down. He left the Winchester by his side, the same calm look on his face, as if he knew the woods would keep watch after him. We buried him on the hill overlooking the hunting trail, under the tallest oak. Every time I visit, I swear I hear that same faint crunch of gravel somewhere in the distance, but it never worries me anymore. Maybe it's just memory echoing through the soil. Or maybe, as Grandpa always said, the land remembers. Either way, no one's ever dared drive a Jeep down that trail again. As dawn broke over the soaked pine valley, the forest looked calm again, but that quiet was a lie. The fake HOA cop's Jeep, wrecked and abandoned after the spike trap, sat rusting by the trailhead like a warning to anyone who might try their luck again. Grandpa stood with his hands on his hips, the steam of his coffee blending with the morning mist, watching as the sheriff's real deputies loaded the last of the imposters into custody vans. "Trespassing, impersonating officers, carrying unregistered weapons," one of the deputies muttered. "Guess they didn't read the signs." Grandpa only grinned, his leathery face unreadable beneath his hat. He turned to me and said quietly, "See, boy, you don't win by yelling louder. You win by letting the truth step out of the woods when it's good and ready." Weeks later, after the chaos had settled and our trail was safe again, I walked that same dirt road alone. The pine needles crunched under my boots, and the faint marks of the Jeep's tires had already been erased by rain. Nature doesn't keep the memory of fools for long. The county sealed the area as private property, granting Grandpa full authority to guard the hunting land, and the HOA's remaining board members went silent, pretending they'd never backed the imposters. When I reached the bend where the Jeep had flipped, I noticed Grandpa's old spike trap, now hung high on a tree like a war trophy gleaming in the morning light. A symbol of grit, of legacy, of how the land always defends those who defend it first. The forest was alive again, humming with peace. As I turned back toward the cabin, I caught a glimpse of Grandpa sitting on the porch, the same sly smirk on his face, whittling wood like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. Something had changed. The HOA had learned their final lesson. Out here, power doesn't come from a badge or a fake title. It comes from knowing every inch of the land beneath your feet and having the courage to protect it.